Welcome back to the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit training series. This training series is meant to walk public housing residents through how to organize and run a successful resident council so that you can improve your housing and community. We encourage you to participate in the entire training series.
This training is based on the guide for developing a memorandum of understanding between the resident council and the housing agency.
This training will cover creating an MOU with the housing agency, and
Negotiating an MOU with the housing agency.
we will also review the sample MOU provided in the toolkit.
Before going into the specifics, here are some key points related to MOUs. The Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is an agreement between a resident council and a housing agency, called a PHA.
The MOU spells out the working relationship between the two parties.
The process of creating an MOU can help build a relationship between the resident council and the housing agency.
And there are community organizations that can support your resident council in creating and negotiating an MOU.
A Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU for short, is a written agreement between two parties.
In this case, we are discussing the MOU between the housing agency and the resident council.
Please note that in this training, we are using the term resident council, but you might call your group of residents who work together to improve the community a tenant council, tenant association, resident association, or tenant or resident organization, or another name.
An MOU spells out a common understanding of the working relationship between a resident council and a housing agency. It defines
What kind of support a housing agency will provide a resident group,
meaningful ways for residents to participate in improving their community,
and ways residents can make decisions related to the housing agency's plans, policies, and procedures.
according to HUD rules. Housing agencies with 250 units or more must
Have a memorandum of understanding with a duly elected resident council that describes the partnership.
This MOU must be updated at least every 3 years.
Housing agencies with fewer than 250 units are not required by HUD regulations to enter into an MOU with the resident council. However, a housing agency resident council MOU is a best practice, and all PHAs are always encouraged to negotiate MOUs with the resident councils.
Contents of an MOU include at a minimum, but are not limited to,
The scope and intended action or project of the MOU, and
the names of the parties and their respective responsibilities,
other items to include are
the length or period of the agreement,
when the agreement begins and
when or how either party can terminate the agreement.
it is important to note that it may be difficult to enforce, in court or otherwise, an MOU unless it includes a clause indicating consequences for non-performance.
Let's now do a quick knowledge check. The MOU between housing agencies and resident councils must be updated at least every how many years?
A, 1, B, 2, C, 3, or D, 4.
We'll pause for you to consider your answer. If you would like to consult the slides or the guide, you can pause the webinar.
If you answered C, 3, you were correct. If not, you may want to go back and review the slides or guide. The PHA and Resident Council may decide to renew their MOU more frequently, but HUD rules require the MOU be revisited at least every 3 years.
True or false? According to HUD rules, housing agencies with 250 units or more must have a memorandum of understanding with the resident council that describes their partnership.
We'll pause for you to consider your answer.
This is true. HUD rules require housing agencies with 250 units or more to have an MOU with any duly elected resident council, and all PHAs, regardless of size, are encouraged to negotiate MOUs with duly elected resident councils.
Having an MOU is important for a number of reasons. It's required when the PHA has more than 250 units. As noted, HUD regulations say that the housing agency and the resident council need a written agreement that details the elements of their partnership agreement, and it shall be updated at least once every 3 years.
It provides clarity. An MOU ensures that the resident council and the housing agency are on the same page with regards to regulations, responsibilities, and any agreements.
It provides accountability. The MOU helps the housing agency and resident council work together. It makes sure both groups will meet their responsibilities under HUD regulations. It can be helpful to specifically spell out what provisions mean. For example, instead of just noting that the PHA will share documents, include how much notice the resident council will have to review the documents and which documents will be shared.
It provides stability and continuity. Putting agreements in writing ensures that they are there to refer to at any time when needed. If the specific people involved change, for example, a new president of the resident council is elected or staff at the housing agency change, they will have the agreement to refer to.
All housing agencies, regardless of size, are required to
Permit residents to organize. This means the housing agency cannot stop your resident council from meeting, putting up flyers, or holding events.
recognize the first duly elected resident council as the sole representative of the residents and not officially recognize a competing resident council. However, to stay recognized as the proper representative of the resident council needs to remain democratic. That means regularly holding elections and not discriminating against any residents.
Provide guidance to residents when requested in establishing and maintaining a resident council, and
Provide the resident council with information concerning the PHA policies on resident participation in management.
these requirements may be added to the MOU with any specific information on how they should be carried out. For example, the MOU could specify how information will be shared.
Additionally, among other requirements, housing agencies with more than 250 units of public housing are required to
Provide a duly recognized resident council office space and meeting facilities, free of charge, preferably within the property it represents.
negotiate with the resident council on all uses of community space for meetings, recreation and social services, and other resident participation activities if requested.
Ensure open communication and frequent meetings between PHA management and resident councils, and encourage the formation of joint PHA management resident committees to work on issues and planning.
Provide training. Specifically, the regulations say, in collaboration with the resident councils, the housing agency shall assume the lead role for assuring maximum opportunities for skills training for public housing residents. To the extent possible, the training resources should be local to ensure maximum benefit and ongoing access.
These requirements may also be added to the MOU with any specific information on how they should be carried out. For example, the MOU could detail the frequency of meetings or how community space for meetings will be provided.
This is an overview of the process that resident councils will use for creating an MOU with the housing agency. The resident council will
Get resident input.
create a working group to negotiate the MOU,
Get support for creating the MOU.
go back to the residents for more input,
Send the draft MOU to the housing agency.
prepare to negotiate,
Meet with the housing agency to negotiate.
decide on compromises with the full resident council,
Agree on a final draft in a full resident council meeting. And finally,
celebrate with the resident council.
we will go through each of these steps in more detail.
The thorough process for creating the first MOU will likely take at least a few months.
A good MOU is very detailed, so it will likely make sense to have a committee draft it, but it is important to get resident input throughout the process.
The resident council or committee should create the first draft of the MOU. This will let the resident council internally determine priorities and what processes they would like to propose.
Your resident council can use the sample MOU as a starting point for your discussions and drafts.
To start the process, get resident input. Find out,
What issues are most important to residents?
how do residents want to work with the housing agency?
If residents have experience with the resident council, what worked or did not work?
For ideas on how to engage residents and get resident input, see Guide 2 in the related training on engaging residents and representing resident interests.
Create an MOU working group. This small group of residents will create a draft MOU, consult with the resident council, and negotiate with the housing agency.
Get support in drafting and negotiating your MOU.
Ask an attorney with experience working with resident councils to review your draft for clarity, legal issues, and to ensure nothing is missing.
Contact your local legal aid office
State Pro Bono Bar Association.
or a community organization that provides tenant organizing or other support to renters if the resident council doesn't have an attorney.
You may also get support from another resident council that has successfully negotiated an MOU.
For more ideas, see Guide 6 and the related training on partnering with local and community organizations.
Once the committee has the initial input from residents that it will take to draft an MOU,
This should be brought back to the resident council for additional input and feedback.
next, you will then begin the negotiation process. Send the MOU to the housing agency and request a meeting to discuss the MOU and how to implement it. Give the housing agency time to respond, but follow up if you do not get a response in a few weeks.
Working group members should then prepare to meet with the housing agency. Invite a lawyer or tenant advocate to support you at the meeting, and think about what areas you would be willing to compromise on and which areas are not negotiable.
At the meeting, working group members should present the MOU and rationale behind it to the PHA. One member should take notes. You may need to negotiate the MOU with the housing agency. Start with the resident council's goals around working with the housing agency. Go paragraph by paragraph and note areas of agreement, disagreement, and compromise proposals. Before leaving the meeting, set up a next meeting to either begin your working relationship or continue negotiating.
Decide on any compromises with the full resident council. If you reach an impasse, a supporting organization or third party may be able to help with prioritization or negotiations.
Agree on a final draft in a resident council meeting, and through an official vote, have the president and any officers sign the MOU.
Finally, celebrate. Announce that the resident council and housing agency have an agreement that will allow the organization to be more involved in decisions on issues impacting residents' lives.
Tips for the MOU. For a first MOU, you may want to focus on starting a working relationship with the PHA by specifying a meeting schedule.
Make sure the agreement will work in the real world and that both parties are on the same page about what each item means.
Think about what specific points will look like, and be sure to include any details that will be needed to make sure the item actually happens.
For example, don't say the PHA and resident council will meet regularly.
Instead, spell out how often their groups will meet and in what months the meetings will take place.
Meetings between the PHA and resident council board of directors will take place quarterly in January, April, July, and October.
For items that may have a cost, spell out who will pay.
For example, instead of saying something like, the PHA will provide training to the resident council, say,
The PHA will provide 3 trainings per year to the resident council, or $1,000 per year from tenant participation funds allotted to the housing agency will be used to provide training for the resident council.
another example. If the MOU states that an arbitrator will be used to resolve disputes, the MOU should specifically say who will find a volunteer arbitrator or who will pay for an arbitrator. So instead of saying, if a pro bono arbitrator cannot be found, one will be hired, you could say,
If the PHA cannot find a pro bono arbitrator, the housing agency will pay for an arbitrator using tenant participation funds.
the sample MOU is most useful for an individual resident council.
A jurisdiction-wide resident council, which represents residents across multiple properties, can also negotiate an MOU.
You can use this process in the sample MOU as a starting point for drafting an MOU between the housing agency and a jurisdiction-wide resident council. However, there will be different needs to be taken into account. For example, it may be important that each building has a representative at meetings with the housing agency.
Note, HUD strongly recommends that housing agencies and resident councils consult their own lawyers before signing any legal document, including this sample MOU.
Your state laws or other factors may affect this agreement.
Again, local bar associations, law schools, or legal aid societies may be able to help.
Let's now do another quick knowledge check. PHAs are required to permit residents to organize.
A, if there is a duly elected resident council. B, if the resident council has an MOU with the PHA. C, if the PHA owns 250 or more units. Or D, always.
We'll pause for you to consider your answer.
If you answered D, always, you were correct. If not, you may want to go back and review the slides or the guide. HUD requires that all housing agencies permit resident organizing. There are benefits to qualifying as a duly elected resident council, but residents can organize in other informal ways too. An MOU is helpful and is required if the PHA operates 250 or more units, and if there is a duly elected resident council.
Contents of an MOU should include, at a minimum, but are not limited to,
A, the scope and intended action of the MOU. B, the names of the parties and their respective responsibilities. C, when or how either party can terminate the agreement, or D, all of the above.
We'll pause while you consider your answer.
The correct answer is D. All of the answers above should be included in an MOU. The scope and intended action of the MOU, the names of the parties and their respective responsibilities, and when or how either party can terminate the agreement. Additionally, it should include the length of the agreement.
Let's look at the sample MOU provided in this toolkit. It can be used as a starting point for your resident council. Consider how each section will work for your resident council and use the process outlined above to work with your housing agency. If you try something and it doesn't work, remember you can renegotiate with the housing agency.
Let's look at the sample MOU. If the sample MOU works for your resident council, or there are just minor changes, you can use the document directly by filling in the blanks. For example, I would add the name of my resident council here. You can also copy and paste sections of the document that you want to use. So I can use keyboard shortcuts to paste this section into an editable document. Then I can just fix up the formatting.
These first sections of the MOU detail the parties, the resident council and the PHA. The goal of both the resident council and the PHA. These sections are there to set a tone and ground the rest of the document in the goals. If during negotiations there are disagreements on specific sections, you can come back to these commitments and see how these issues align. The highlighted section formally states the overarching goal of having a mutually respectful and productive relationship and explains that the MOU formalizes this relationship by setting out each party's responsibilities.
The document then moves into the specific responsibilities. First, the PHA responsibilities.
For example, numbers 3 and 4 here relate to the PHA responsibility to permit the resident council to organize. The PHA will provide guidance, information, meeting space, and meaningful opportunities to make decisions.
It then goes into specific actions the PHA will take. For example, number 7 notes how many times the PHA will meet with the resident council. Note that you can fill in the agreed upon number of times.
In number 13, there is also a space to fill out what is considered a prompt response from the PHA to resident council's suggestions and requests.
The document then moves into the resident council responsibilities. This document includes many of the responsibilities that should already be outlined in the resident council bylaws.
For example, number 5 includes space for you to write the minimum number of times the resident council will meet each year. And number 6 again includes the minimum number of times the resident council will meet with the PHA.
Numbers 8, 9, and 10 include the basics around resident council obligations with respect to tenant participation funds. However, those details should be outlined in a separate document.
The document closes with noting that the agreement stays in effect until it is revised, and that it must be revised at least once every 3 years. It then includes the date when the full resident council accepts the MOU.
The document then includes optional sections.
This includes additional responsibilities of the PHA, which relate to opportunities that may be of interest to some resident councils, such as having a space on the PHA board meeting agendas, taking on management responsibilities, developing economic opportunities, or being involved in PHA hiring or the PHA budget.
There's also an optional section on how disputes can be resolved. As recommended above, more specificity can be added to this section.
Finally, there's an optional section that requires reviewing the MOU with the full resident council each year. This is advisable so that newly engaged residents will be aware of the resident council commitments in the MOU and to ensure updates are identified when they are needed.
For ideas on how to engage residents and get resident input, see Guide 2, Engaging Residents and Representing Resident Interests.
For more ideas, see Guide 6, Partnering with Local and Community Organizations.
These links are clickable in the downloadable training slides and in the guide.
This training is part of the Public Housing Resident Organizing and Participation Toolkit. The full toolkit includes topical guides, customizable resident council documents and forms, tools related to tenant participation funds, and case studies of resident organizations around the country.
The next training in the series is on bylaws.